Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started, so if you can grab a seat, please. Welcome to this edition of the Albers Executive Speaker Series. My name is Joe Phillips. I'm Dean of the Albers School, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody here tonight. Tonight we're going to host a discussion on diversity and inclusion that features panelists from Amazon, REI, and Weyerhaeuser. And before introducing the panelists, I would like to introduce Father Steve Sundborg, President of Seattle U. Father, please come.
Thank you very much, Joe, and I look forward to this panel and this subject. It's an important one for all of us, isn't it? And greetings for 2018. Welcome back from the break. This is the best thing going on at Seattle University's Albers Executive Speaker Series. This is a great way to kick off this new year. My remarks this evening as I begin are a little bit more serious, but they deservedly are so. Monday is Martin Luther King Day, and this year that is heightened because later we'll be marking the milestone of the 50th anniversary of his assassination. I'm privileged on Monday to be a keynote speaker at a Martin Luther King breakfast talking on the subject of white privilege. So I thought I might begin tonight by just a couple things from Martin Luther King himself that might help us enter into some dimension of his life and his remarks that we're not as perhaps familiar with as we might be. He writes in the letter from Birmingham jail, which was written on toilet paper in a jail in Birmingham, where he was put in jail on Good Friday because of his actions in protest of what was going on in that city. He writes the following: I must confess that over the last few years I have been greatly disappointed with the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. I had hoped that the white moderate would see this. I guess I should have realized that few members of a race that has oppressed another race can understand or appreciate the deep groans and passionate yearnings of those who have been oppressed, and still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action. And so a brief prayer from Martin Luther King. Help us, Lord, to realize that we were created to shine like the stars and live on through all eternity. Keep us, we pray, in perfect peace. Help us to walk together, pray together, sing together, and live together until that day when all God's children, black, white, red, and yellow, will rejoice in one common band of humanity in the kingdom of our Lord and of our God. We pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. Joe?
Thank you, Father. Before introducing our panelists, let me go over the format. So, Dr. Holly Ferraro, who is Associate Professor of Management and Director of our Professional MBA program, will be our moderator. She'll be starting off with some questions. And then after she finishes with her very deep and penetrating questions, then we'll go to questions from the audience. And you can provide the softball questions, right? We expect to wrap up at 6:45 p.m., not the normal 6:30 p.m. So let me introduce our panelists. So first, in the middle is Denise Merle. Denise serves as the Senior Vice President for Human Resources and Information Technology at Weyerhaeuser. She's done that since February of 2016. And prior to her current role, she served as SVP of Human Resources and Investor Relations. She's held various roles in the company's paper and packaging businesses, including finance, capital planning, and analysis, and business development. She has her undergraduate degree in accounting from Pacific Lutheran University and her MBA from Seattle U. And then closest to me is Margie Elliott, and she is the Marketing and Communications Leader in Amazon's Global Diversity and Inclusion Organization. Prior to joining Amazon in 2016, she ran marketing for Columbia University's Technology Ventures office for 9 years. She has her master's in public health from Columbia and her undergraduate degree from NYU. She lives in Fairfax, Virginia, and is substituting for one of her Amazon colleagues at the very last minute, so we're very lucky to have her with us and lucky to have her in town today. And then finally, furthest from me is Laura Swap. Laura joined REI in 2011 and was named Director of Public Affairs and Next Gen Marketing in 2014. Prior to REI, she worked as the Senior Director for Diversity at McKesson and the Director of Global Diversity at Starbucks. And she is also Vice President of the REI Foundation. She earned her undergraduate degree in anthropology from the University of California, San Diego, and her master's degree in sociological practice from Cal State San Marcos. So those are our panelists, and I will hand it over to Holly.
Thank you, Joe. And here. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to moderate this panel and to engage the Albers community. There. So turning things on always helps. So I'm really honored to have the opportunity to moderate this panel and to engage the Albers community in a conversation with business leaders where we can gain insight into how companies are thinking about and managing diversity and inclusion. I think it's especially important to contextualize the panel in light of things that are going on in our country and in our businesses around race and gender. One of the beauties of a panel like this is that we have an opportunity to hear from places that always aren't heard. And so our panel is female, and also originally included 2 African American women as well. Unfortunately, one of them told us around Christmas that she wasn't going to be able to make it, and we have Laura Swap as a very able replacement, and then Latasha Gillespie let us know today that she had some things that had come up and she wasn't able to make it. So I think it's important for our community to know that we're committed to bringing many diverse voices into this conversation. And we are very appreciative and welcome the panelists that we have tonight. So thank you all for being here. So I'll start with this question. Some critics of diversity initiatives within companies say that the very definition of diversity, and sometimes even just using the word diversity, so talking about race and gender, is a problem. So how does your company define diversity and inclusion? And why? Why have you decided to define it that way? What about that works for you? What's missing?
Okay, is it on? So at REI, we actually don't use the word. And that's been an evolution over time. So what we talk about is a for-all strategy. And the for-all strategy explicitly is a strategy of inclusion. And so there are components of that for the brand about who we want to be for, how we expect to behave, what our kind of the soul of the place is. But then we have agendas very specifically by dimensions of diversity. So a very comprehensive agenda around women. We're working on an agenda around race, but I'd say it's our weakest spot. We have a very connected agenda around sexual orientation. The reason we've chosen not to use the word diversity is because we know as soon as we say it inside an organizational context, we're working against a concept that immediately comes to mind. And the complexity of that is it's actually not a shared concept. It's different for everyone you talk to. And it is weighted often with organizational life and expectations that we have found not to be entirely useful. So we're trying to actually create a new definition. And I think it's a work in progress, but it's the approach that we're taking. I think there was a second part to your question, but we can come back to it about working or not? What do we lose in that?
So I would add at Weyerhaeuser, we're kind of in a transition period as well. One of our development programs is a next gen program where we pick 12 high potential leaders and they go through a really intense training for 12 months, and they're given an active learning project that they actually do for the executive team. So we actually hand a project to them and ask them to make recommendations to the executives. And last year what we gave them was diversity and inclusion, and how do we really make an impact with how we are looking at diversity and inclusion. So they actually spent a year working on that, presented to us, and also we had them present to our board of directors. And one of the things that we've really been working on, and one of the suggestions that came out was really talking about it. I know we're going to talk about this more later, but talking about diversity. And so for a company, we don't really focus on diversity, we focus on inclusion. So similar to REI, our company vision is working together. Those are the first two words, and we think that they're the two most important words in our vision. And so we're trying to create a culture that's very welcoming and respectful, and a place where people are really working together. So we're focusing more on inclusion and the benefits of inclusion, and not the definition of diversity.
Okay, thanks. So at Amazon, we're definitely using the words diversity and inclusion. We're also using the word equity and equality, and thinking about all of those things as we work to understand how we can best serve our global customer base. I think the focus on inclusion is a really, really good one. We see diversity as something that like honoring and respecting the differences, the unique differences that all of our employees have, whether that's gender, race, sexual orientation, disability status, national origin, their age. There's so many things, veteran status, so many things that kind of encapsulate diversity, and the intersectionality of all of those things too. So people are not just one thing. You know, I am not only a woman, I'm many other things, and so how can we honor and respect the differences of our employees, and then also enable them to bring their whole selves to work through the processes of inclusion.
So maybe going back to the second part of the question about how it's working, maybe especially picking up on what you just said around equity, does the focus on inclusion also make sure that representation, for example, that people are getting hired and are retained, things like that?
Well, I can say that's something we're really focused on, and you know, key for us is development. So it's attraction, retention, and development. So looking to ensure that our applicant pools are as diverse as possible, and then we watch those pools all the way through the hiring process to see if we have gaps anywhere along the way that we may need to address, and then looking at our workforce and saying, you know, does our executive team and our board reflect our workforce? And when we put these development programs into place, are we bringing ratios of diverse candidates into those programs to ensure that we're continuing to develop everyone? So that's how we're looking at it.
Yeah, so from an equity standpoint, absolutely, you know, looking at ways very similarly attract, the develop, and the retain pieces, that those are things that are actively ongoing for us. We're also looking for ways to develop leaders. I don't have anything particularly new to add there.
I think that it's table stakes for companies now to think about diversity. You're thinking about acquisition and development and retention, And I think it's a thing that you will see in most big companies. As are, and if they're not, you should be asking, like pay equity, where we do, pay equity studies, and these are the operational well-being of the organization. I think with the inclusion, or for us, what we call the for all is the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the work of the sum of the parts is different, right? So we've spent the last year really digging into gender equity along every part of our business, from like product to marketing to experiences to content to our workforce. And that requires a different kind of work than the landscape if we were looking at, say, race and people of color in our workforce, or sexual orientation, where we've had more of a political agenda. So that's why I think, like, sometimes looking, the inclusion or for all gives you the intersectionality and the sense of the collective, but there are specific issues by different communities and organizations that require different kinds of works. Things like diversifying, your sourcing channels, or thinking about development programs can serve all of those, but then there's topically specific work, which I think really challenges organizations. How do you dig into those things, which are sticky sometimes.
So, great, I love that you brought us back to the for all. I had written that down. And recently, some companies like Deloitte, for example, have decided to end their use of affinity groups, like women's resource groups or African American resource groups, in favor of inclusion councils, because they feel that the affinity groups were artificial and isolated women and people of color from leaders who could sponsor them. So does your company use affinity groups or other ways of trying to connect people? I'm always concerned when I hear people talk about getting rid of affinity groups. We can talk about that more in a second. So
I'm happy to start. So we have affinity groups, and we've read that study, and also other studies that Kapoor Center for Social Capital has done some research around, what moves the needle for diversity and inclusion, particularly in tech, and affinity groups or employee resource groups are definitely not the answer. They found, having a director of diversity and inclusion, definitely not the answer by itself, right? These things won't move the needle on their own. But as a collective, they can move the needle. We found at Amazon, we have 9 affinity groups. We have over 25,000 members of our affinity groups around the world, chapters globally, and they're not only great places for people to connect with their peers and find others who might be like them in a very big company, or allies in a very big company, but they're also a place where the business actually goes for ideas and for advice and for support. So we have a Persons with Disabilities affinity group, and they're often on user testing and checking out new technologies and helping us assess things. Similarly, we had an idea recently come through our Black Employee Network where some employees who had an idea, part of the affinity group, they had an idea together, and they wrote their idea up in a paper, and it moved up the chain and got a green light, and then those employees got the resourcing they need to build out that idea, and it's actually something that's going to be launched this quarter, which is super exciting to see these things coming through. And then even on the inclusion side, we've had the affinity groups supporting things. So we recently built a resource kit for our managers to help support employees who might be transitioning in the workplace. And we work closely with our LGBTQ affinity group, which is called Glamazon. They supported that effort and provided a lot of insight into creating those resources. So those are just a few examples, but we find them to be tremendously valuable and important, not only for our employees, but also for the business.
So our affinity groups kind of faded out over the past few years, and one of the recommendations that the Next Gen group brought up was to really revitalize those groups and connect them to the businesses, and also create an inclusion council, which would be the leader of each of the groups. We have 9 groups, and myself,
and where we would look across the different groups to kind of bring the whole together. And, you know, I can say back early in my career, 30 years ago, there was a Women in Action affinity group, and I didn't join that group. It just didn't feel right for me at the time. And I think it's much different than today's affinity groups. And so, you know, when I first came into the role as Senior Vice President of HR, I thought, why do we have 9 groups? Don't we all want to be together, like everyone together? And would that be a better outcome? Would we really help people? And the leader of the Black group sat me down and goes, let me explain to you why it's important to have affinity groups. And I spent an hour and a half with him, and I really learned a lot. I walked out of the room with such respect for him, you know, that's a hard thing to do, to, you know, sit down with the senior vice president and tell him why their ideas stinks. And he did it in a really professional way, and I walked out of there with a really different context and view. And so what we're doing with our Inclusion Council, 2 things really. One, it's going to be a great leadership development and exposure for the leaders of the affinity groups. And then secondly, we're tying the work that they do in those groups to our business goals. So much as you heard Amazon say that how they're looking at tying things to helping the businesses achieve the goals, that's what our affinity groups will also be doing. And so we're really excited. We just kicked that off this year.
We don't have affinity groups, and that's not because we have a policy against having them. We have a very open door policy, and have always sort of said that if we have sort of a nascent pride group, that they're literally, REI has been sort of interesting, unlike say Starbucks, where I actually launched affinity groups. Those are still there. McKesson and I launched a very professional, heavy investment, where I do not believe they are successful if they don't come from employees. And I have seen companies attempt to institute them and really struggle and fail. So my point of view on them is I have seen them work really well where employees want them, where organizations are ready for them, where they're connected to something more meaningful, and I've seen them really flail and struggle and swirl. So we don't have them, though we're open to them, but even in times of trying to convene employees at REI, say around gender equity in the last year, around marriage equality when Washington was going to ballot. It is an organization, interestingly, where people, even across a lot of traditional dimensions of diversity, feel so committed to their outdoor culture, and that intersectionality is like, well, like I'm a mountain biker, and like, yeah, I'm a lesbian, and I'm a professional, but my discretionary time is thought of differently. So it's an interesting thing for us. So I'm on the fence as to, I think there's certain conditions under which they're very successful, and it sounds like you've got 2 organizations here who kind of understand what those are, and it's been pretty well studied. But they also can sometimes go wrong when people are not clear. I think one thing is, like, if you don't really help employees understand what they're for, it's very hard, like, for people to put words to their experience in a way that's like, now, put words to this in a way which is productive and a strategy to help your company. Sometimes people are seeking community, you know, and that's like a part of what it's serving, and things get messy, you know, so conditions I think under which they could be successful. For us, we don't have them right now, but I never say never.
I think one of the things that's interesting about where all of you have come with affinity groups and thinking about both the business case as well as the value that it has for the employees. One of the things that seemed to come up to me in the discussions, the things that I've read about getting rid of affinity groups, is maybe there are some folks within the organization who just feel like they're being left out. And so one of the criticisms of diversity management in general is that perhaps we're just not willing to have some hard conversations that we need to have around there are conditions within companies that need to be addressed, so we're not having hard conversations about racism and gender discrimination and other ways that inequities are replicated in the workplace. So how does your company encourage, or are you encouraging those kinds of difficult conversations about diversity at work? What's working and what's still challenging for you?
I think, one of the things that like gets me riled up about diversity is I feel like it always presumes a problem. And once you set it in that way, you will find problems. I mean, so one of the things, I mean, we always look at all of our employees' survey data, and we actually ask sexual orientation, we ask gender identity, we ask gender, we ask race, we look at it by every level, by every division. So like that's the sensing piece of the culture, and we've done that for a long time to understand experientially if people are having different kinds of experiences. And then there are the things like you can look at hard numbers, you can look at pay equity, and then there's like intuiting the soul of your company at a moment in time, like sexual harassment is blowing up, and you feel like your company should say something to employees. And that's when I think like that it gets hard and conversations get real. Like, do we touch it, do we not touch it? And you see as soon as companies start speaking, if they get it a little bit wrong, the world will come for them. I have to say REI, and I've said this since the beginning, has suffered me so graciously in my like pushing of like there are times where there are conversations that have to be had, and that's like the hard work of diversity. But there's also just moments of like real missed relevance and opportunity and fun. And so like how do you put those things together in a conversation? Sometimes it is about like we wanted our CEO to send a message to employees that addressed both the racial violence in the country and sexual, the harassment and the blowing up. And that, that took some work to like find a voice and to assure our executive team that there's a way to do that. So I think you do need advocates to find your voice in a moment and in an ongoing way. And sometimes you just need people to have deeper understanding of relevance in the world that we live in, which looks like this classroom, on a day-to-day basis, so they're having relevant conversations.
I'm making an assumption, but it might not be right, but getting a CEO or the executive team to have the voice at those times, it is difficult. And I think one caveat, and I'll just say, speak for myself, sometimes what's hard is not that they don't want to say those things, it's all the stakeholders that you have to think about, right? So, what are the issues that you're going to come out and say something about? Because if you don't say something, if you say something about one issue but not the next issue that's just as vitally important to the other employees, then, that you have to be really thoughtful about that. And so I think that's why it takes work sometimes. I do agree. I think having those tough conversations are they're hard. It's hard. And not just for executive teams, I think for employees in total. When our team went out and did benchmarking and they started calling other companies, it was hard. You want to talk about diversity and inclusion? Okay, what's your question? I mean, it was hard. You really had to build a relationship before, or call someone in HR or global diversity that would open up and really talk to you. And I think where a lot of that comes from is fear. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to offend someone. And I'll tell you a little story, because Holly said we can tell stories. My niece is at the University of Michigan studying to get her PhD in chemistry, and she was invited to a women's leadership afternoon of development. And she said, I got there a little bit late because I was in the lab, and I noticed that everyone had something written underneath their name, so I just quickly wrote, I just assumed it was your major, I just quickly wrote chemistry, and I went and sat down. And the woman next to me looked at me and said, well, that's interesting. And she said, oh, my major? And she goes, no, you were supposed to write the pronoun, the gender pronoun that you associate with. And she goes, well, I really do like chemistry, though. I mean, you can just call me chemistry. And then she went on to tell me there are 49, gender pronouns that you can associate with, and she wanted to know if I knew all 49. And at the time I didn't, but I do now. And, that is, our world is a great place. But I do think people are afraid to talk. And so one of the things that we have spent a lot of time on as an executive team is just talking and creating a place where people feel comfortable. And I have executives come into my office sometimes and say, is this okay? I want to do this. I'm like, yeah, absolutely, go do it. So, I think creating an environment where people feel safe and comfortable and having those conversations is really powerful.
That's great. I think, these are hard conversations. It is a lot of fun, but they're hard conversations. I'm going to also send Latasha's regrets tonight. She really wishes she could have been here, but I am also trying to bring her voice. So one thing that Latasha always says is we've got to get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And that's something that I'm practicing every day, and I hope that you'll practice too. Get comfortable being uncomfortable, and don't be afraid of the difficult situations, because those are the times when you're learning. And so Latasha's been in her role for the last year, and we've really been working on a few big things to kind of address these difficult conversations in such a big company, and how do we empower our employees to have those conversations, and also empower the managers to appropriately address and be inclusive in challenging times. And something that we're excited about is an internal conference that we're working on it's actually called Conversations on Race and Ethnicity. That's going to be a really a new thing that we've done at Amazon, but they are tough conversations. So we are bringing in outside leaders and speakers to help inform our employees on how can we address these things. And certainly at Amazon we have a long way to go when it comes to equity and or not to equity, but to representation across our workforce. So when we're looking at ways to improve that, how can we also improve our inclusion by having these conversations?
I just want to say, making other people comfortable is exhausting work. And probably those of us on the stage, it's like the thing I think, and if you're thinking about you want to do this kind of work, you have to get real that you're in it for the long game, and that you're going to have your thought bubble. Sometimes things come out of my mouth and I'm like, did that actually come out of my mouth? Or
We always say inside voice.
yeah. And maybe you have enough credibility, but even as we're having it, it's just exhausting to think how, so many people are uncomfortable all the time, and yet in organizations we do a lot of work to make people comfortable to have these conversations because you're committed to a long game. And the way that you would manifest the work if you were in the community or a group of friends or in your family will be different than in an organization where you have so many considerations, and the agreement that you make with employees is different. And I think it's why I think the average tenure of a diversity professional is 3 years, because I think most people are just this is part of what makes it hard is that you're working so hard to make people comfortable, and that that's exhausting, because it's maybe comfort's overrated. Who's comfortable in the world? It's not a comfortable world. And yet, it is an important part of setting the conditions, because you're in it for the long run. So you have this super professional, we all do the professional, right things that we know over time are going to matter. But you're also a human just thinking, gosh, if people could just be in the world in a different way, this wouldn't be so hard. And I also want to say that, because I don't remember if we had a strategy about it or a question about it, that there is a strategy which is around humor. And I think it takes intimacy between people to have humor. But with an executive team, if you have a lot of trust, that you can be less careful in a way that can, I have colleagues where I could say mansplain much, in a moment, and they would know I care about them, and that they just got checked in a way that wasn't can we have a conversation, and I scripted it out. I'm not saying you should do that like to your professor or something, but like that you might, that like there's also, you build relationships with people wherein like just in a moment something can, you know, like learning happens in very thoughtful ways, but also in these moments with people. Like your executives coming into your office and saying, can I do this?
So many things. So there are so many things that you said that I want to follow up on. So one of them is around the idea of dealing with fear and trying to make or help people to be more comfortable. I think one of the things that could come from that is, there could be things that people would say that you decide, wow, we weren't expecting that and we're uncomfortable with what you just said. So how do you deal with policies around, for example, zero tolerance for certain comments perhaps coming up? Because as we make other people comfortable, it could make people who are pretty vulnerable very uncomfortable, that new and different things come up that were created in some ways by the environments that are created. So
We have swift zero tolerance. Like REI is probably the highest integrity place I've ever seen, and I've seen people swiftly disappear. And I don't mean difference of opinion, but I mean a line drawn for just integrity. I think which, when you understand your compass as a company, gives you pretty clear parameters, and leaders are lined up to that.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. We're 117 years old as a company, and our core values are really, really strong. So, you know, I always, whenever I hear something, you know, something occurred, you always have to look at the intent. What was the intent behind it? And, you know, did someone make a mistake, or was it a zero tolerance situation? And where those situations are zero tolerance, we let people go immediately.
Yeah, we're similar. We don't tolerate any abuse or harassment of any kind, and any, you know, reported situations are taken very seriously.
I will say, we've walked people out the door who had good intent, but like say as a manager, missed the role that they were asked to perform in terms of like managing, I mean, it's like specifics that I can't get into, but things where we even said to people like, we know you didn't intend that, but you were still responsible for it. And it was a core responsibility of your job in terms of what you were expected to do and how you were expected to show up, and we will have to ask you to leave. And acknowledging that sometimes like mistakes can be made at that magnitude, even from well-intentioned people, but that doesn't abdicate you from responsibility. Different than like you put your foot in your mouth,
Right.
you know.
And we do the same.
Yeah, like your foot in your mouth, like there has to be room for people putting their foot in their mouth, I think, which is different. I mean, because if you don't, you won't ever talk. I think people don't want to talk because if you're Dara at Microsoft, I mean, like we could do the whole panel just on Google, and that's like more than a foot in your mouth, but like that if you say you're Starbucks and race together, like if you don't get it right, the world will come for you, so people don't talk. So I think you have to have room for your foot in your mouth. But organizations, I think, know, well, maybe they don't know. Never mind, I rescind that comment. You should look for organizations that know who they are and that are willing to be behind that.
I did some, two things that I'm interested in. One is this idea of intimacy, building intimacy, and so that people are able to feel more comfortable, right? How can we build these relationships? And so I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. How are you developing intimacy, building relationships so that people can be more comfortable, have these conversations? And then I'm going to just piggyback on that a little bit, that this summer I was doing some research with a foundation, and they talked about the disconnect, right? So you could have at your level great intentions. The company has policies, plans, etc., but somewhere in between the top and the people who are doing the work, these policies are not being completely followed. So maybe talk about that as well, how you're getting it through the organization, how you develop relationships.
Yeah, so I would say, you know, at Amazon, again, we're working on it, and one area that I think we're doing well is within our leadership principles, which are things that we actually talk about on a very daily basis and are part of our how we hire and how we promote and how we work on all of our projects. We have a leadership principle that's our write a lot, and our write a lot includes that in order to be write a lot, you have to seek diverse perspectives and actually work to disconfirm your own beliefs. So when was the last time you went into an argument asking somebody to convince you otherwise, or went into a room saying, tell me why I'm wrong? But that's actually built into our DNA and our leadership principles. And so we're always looking for feedback and ideas outside of our own team or outside of our own perspective, and that's encouraged and like built into the processes that we have because of the leadership principles.
I think I just got a new leadership principle to add. I like that a lot. One of the things that we're doing is creating, because I think a lot of those relationships happen organically by different projects and relationships and teams that you work on over the course of your daily responsibilities. But one of the things that we're really working on is having the executives talk about it. So you will hear them talking about the diversity of application pools, or how we're looking at folks that we're bringing into our leadership programs, pay equity, all of those different things. But where you really start to see success is when that's driven down deeper into the organization, and it becomes natural that people are just continuing to talk about it. But I think as far as the relationships, at least for us, a lot of those happen organically.
No, it's tricky. I think they're two different answers. I mean, when I was talking about the intimacy, I was just thinking of my different leaders. Like, I will regularly text executives, like I'm forever sending someone a podcast, an article, like not always formal learning, but like they will have said something to me which indicates I know they're interested in something, and like it's just an over time trying to cultivate a conversation that has layers, that isn't always like in the context of a meeting. I mean, I work in an informal culture, so that's like an acceptable way to communicate. And I think you have to be really comfortable yourself. Like, right, I have to exhibit a lot of comfort in conversations. Now, I work in marketing, and so we haven't really talked about that, so I do much less with the employees. I'm all about trying to infiltrate, like, changing the story. Like, it's my just, singular focus, because I think of the scale of that, and we've seen so much even in the last week about that, but who gets to represent? Like, who is the outdoors for? Whose films are we investing in? Who's our cast? What stories are we telling? What media are we buying? So that's the work that I do. That's my day job, and that's kind of how I make change. I think it's always hard to drop from an executive intention and strategy down to the front line, and for us that's store employees. We have a very activist store employee population. There's probably green vests in this room right now, and they will tell us all day long, loud and clear, what they like or what they don't. But like when we launched Force of Nature in the spring, which is this, wholly focused effort on gender diversity and gender equity, and we said for the rest of the year, we're only going to feature women. We're only, in all of our media, like you just have to pause and imagine, like we have paid media and social channels and print media, and in all of our employee blogs, and half of our customers are men, and slightly more than half of our employees are men. And we had to do a really heavy lift on getting to employees at the store level and then all the way up first. Like, why are we doing this? What does it mean for men? Like that was, I remember when we pitched that idea of what we talk about as the total takeover, I just thought this is a bad idea. Like our male CEO and our male chief creative officer are gonna be like, we can't do that. Like we can't show only women for almost an entire year. But we did, and the world didn't fall apart. But heavy lift with employees at the store level, and engagement for like, how do you own this? So I think it's something you have to be mindful of, but it's a hard translation to make, and the bigger you get, the harder it is.
So just out of curiosity, how did that idea come? It sounds like it didn't come from the top.
It didn't come from the top. It came, we had an internal body of work focused on gender equity, and I was leading that work. I've always had a real interesting kind of hybrid role, and we were looking at every point of our business. So we had a team, and that team had people who lead product, who lead marketing, brand creative. We had people representing people culture, our HR division, experiences. We have this outdoor school. And the question was, where are you strong with regard to women? Where are your gaps, and what could you impact in 18 months? And the brand marketing team did an audit of all of our creative over a 12-month period, and then they took like 10 publications that REI sells, and they audited those. And they came back and said, this isn't a good look. Like, this is really, really, like, men represent in the story, and we think to right that ship, we're going to have to do something dramatic. And it's not going to be like a 50-50. And they came up with this idea that it should be a total takeover. Like, we should say, what if everything we did was told through the lens of women, and why wouldn't that be relatable? And what would it mean for our vendors? We have thousands of vendors if we said to them, this is what we're doing. And so it came from that team, but we do have a leadership team that likes a big idea, and so it was accepted. And then we had to figure out how to execute it, just tricky.
So I think that's very interesting, because I think one of the things that people talk about when they talk about diversity is whether or not attending to doing the total takeover, right? Whether or not that would mean good business results or bad business results.
Our women's business is up double digits since we launched. So I'm just gonna say, what's interesting about that is that we didn't set, it was not a product campaign. Like, we didn't say we're gonna sell more products. We had no business goals. I mean, we hoped that we wouldn't tank the business. And so what was so powerful is that our women's business grew by double digits, and it hasn't retreated. Yeah, how about that?
And it didn't impact the male business.
It didn't. Our male business went up at launch, and then it leveled out. And our business for girls, like children, that we didn't talk about, went up 30%. And so it was something about like telling a powerful story. And we had, like we have what we call red team meetings, like on the marketing side, like you launch a campaign, you do all this contingency planning, like what's gonna happen if business starts to slip. But it didn't. Sorry, I got excited. I love it so much.
No, that's an exciting story. And
Yeah.
I think that it sort of gives me a question about the extent to which you've had to have those conversations, perhaps, as you've tried to do new things around the area of diversity with people about it's good for folks, but it's also good for business. Have you had to have those discussions with people, and how are you engaging people in that discussion?
Yeah, so this fall, actually, we did Amazon Web Services is our cloud computing business, and our biggest event of the year is actually called Reinvent. It's AWS Reinvent, and this year it was in Las Vegas in November, and we had 43,000 customers there. Yeah, really big event. And historically, we've done women in tech sessions at this event, and they've been well received, and that's been good. But in the last year, we launched a program called We Power Tech within AWS, which is around inclusion in the tech industry. And so it didn't feel right to only do a Women in Tech session at Reinvent this year. And so we actually did a whole We Power Tech diversity series, and we had 4 sessions. We did one on gender identity in tech. We did a second on the racial digital divide in tech. We did a series of lightning talks with customers who are using AWS to improve the space of diversity and inclusion. And then the 4th was a She Powers Tech, focus on women supporting women in tech. And it was actually really well received by the customers. It was the highest rated track of reInvent. There were 38 tracks, something like 1,300 sessions at the conference, and it was the highest rated track. So there's clearly a customer interest, and actually the majority of the speakers across the whole session, or all of the sessions, were customers as well. So it was a really kind of a great example of, I think, engaging the business in a meaningful way, and you know, so far has gotten great traction.
I would say for us, we're a little bit different in that we sell our products to other businesses primarily. So, you know, the timber remanufacturing industry has historically been a pretty male-dominated business. And so one of the things that we've really worked on is growing the ratio of females in our executive leadership and board, and we're at 30% right now. And so that's something that we've really been focused on. We're really, in our industry, it's like unheard of. So one of the things that we do and we spend time on is at industry events, sponsoring women events and speaking to other women. The senior vice president over our Timberlands business just retired. She was the first female to have responsibility for a $5 billion, 13 million acre Timberlands business. And so for people to see her not only as an executive, but as a mother, as a grandmother, and learn that she was very successful in balancing what she needed to balance over the course of her 30-year career. And so we do a lot of roundtables and education within our industry and with our employees and potential employees.
I was gonna say, I just think the business case is table stakes. It's like you're showing up and you have to have it, and it should be really good. But in my whole career, I've found it to move people very little, which I think is interesting. Like if it were just the business case, we would be done. You know, what I love about marketing, are there any marketers in there? Yeah, is so much data. I'm like, oh my God, I have so much data. Like I know everything about my customers. Like I can triangulate your credit card purchases to everything. I know your age, your gender, your race, within very high level of probability. So I know for REI who's buying what, I know where they're buying it, which means I can size a market and I can tell you what the upside is, I can tell you what share of wallet I have by different markets and what there is to get there. And I think you have to do that work and you have to be like really astute, and I don't think it's enough. And it's, you know, at the same time when we tell stories, like we have some incredible long form video, like I'm going to make a plug for the REI Journal. Those stories move people in a way to be open to business that is even more powerful than the business case. But I do think you have to have it. And I love it. Like I love how much I know at the level of granularity, but it's just a piece. I'm so fast.
I think I get a chance to ask one more question before we throw it out to everybody. When you think about all of the experience that you've had around diversity and inclusion, what do you wish that your organization or organizations in general would do that would be new, different, really move us in this space so that we wouldn't have to keep talking about things like H&M, what they just did? And how do we really move this space?
I wish organizations would be unafraid. Like I feel with such clarity, like to me it is so clear. I have so many conversations about like it's gray and it's this and like it's not. Like it's not gray to me. So what I wish is like the highest level of courage to be unafraid to have conversations, and that would be like for me the most exciting thing.
I would add to that. I think one thing that companies really have to do, it's not enough just to talk about diversity or to look at your diversity ratios and pay ratios and all that and say, okay, we're good. That is not the intent. The intent is to create an environment where people are learning from each other, that those perspectives are valued, that they have the conversations they need to have, et cetera. And that, to me, once companies get to that place where they're really valuing the perspectives of everyone and creating that kind of environment, that's when I think we're going to get to that point.
Yeah, I love these answers. I think, you know, as much as we can think big on these topics, I think we should, you know, and I love looking at all of you because I think there's going to be a lot of movement in this space. There's a lot happening right now, but I think there's a lot that's yet to come, and I think it's going to take all of us thinking really big and working together.
Okay, so thank you, panelists. And now we're going to go to some questions from the audience. So there'll be a mic in each aisle. And you raise your hand. We'll try and bring the mic to you and you get to ask a question. So who has the first question? Somebody must, yeah, right here in front.
Hi, can you talk about any efforts to reach out to women and girls to be future executives in the company or people of color?
Yeah, is that for me specifically? Oh, okay. I don't know, I felt like the spotlight came on. Yeah, you know, we've definitely been involved with a lot of organizations. A lot of it is at the grassroots level for different offices in different areas. So I sit in the Washington, D.C. area. So we've done work locally with our code and other programs locally, but on a broader company-wide scale, we've sponsored Girls Who Code classrooms and also supported Code.org and other organizations like that that are working to drive inclusion in the K-16 pipeline.
We're doing the same at the, not code, but at the high school level in really giving exposure to local high schools in the Seattle area so people learn more about our company and the different kinds of roles that are available and kind of what could be types of roles educationally.
I have a couple answers. One is that I think in a direct-to-consumer business like REI, that your best chance to diversify your workforce is to diversify your customer base, because people come to work for you because they know who you are as a brand and they love you. And they're not going to come work for us if they don't know who we are. They think like that is not a relevant brand for me, which is why I'm so passionate about the branding side. So I think step number one is like listen to your customers and be relevant, because then for us, if you can marry your passion for the outdoors with your professional degree, then then we're drawing people. But then we also have relationships. Like we have a relationship with an organization called Camber Outdoors that focuses on women in the outdoor industry. And we did $1.5 million grant to them, but we've got, more impressively, a CEO challenge around diversification of the outdoors. And we went from 3 CEOs to maybe 70 who are actually working. Like there's operational agreements when you sign the CEO pledge. It's actually unlike another pledge that we've been able to find in an industry. So I think there's a way in which like you want to be pulling people to want to come work for you, and you have to be relevant to them. And then there's incredible organizations that you can partner
with. All of this work isn't free, and I guess there's if we look back at the 70s, maybe the more cynical narrative is that companies got on board with hiring women and minorities due to the threat of being sued or brought in front of the Employment Opportunity Commission for discrimination. And I'm just wondering, what are the external or internal drivers that are motivating companies to do this work?
Well, I think there's a lot of studies out there. You look at diverse executive teams, diverse boards, and those companies are more successful. They have higher earnings, they have higher EBITDA, because they are pulling perspectives from a lot of different people. And I think that's a huge motivation for a lot of companies, in that you are taking into consideration lots of different perspectives, and people together are much more successful than one person or one type of person by themselves, and I think that's a huge driver.
Peer pressure. I think there are a lot of companies who want to be in the company of other companies who are recognized for being progressive companies that value diversity and inclusion. And it's not by accident that you see companies influencing each other, and these lists that people vie to be on is about some healthy competition, I think, of a reputation of a company.
Yeah, and I think it's also about representing that customer base, either that you have or that you're seeking. So.
Hello.
Hi, so I wanted to drill down a little bit on the conversation around zero tolerance and the different type of workplace cultures around people feeling comfortable, etc. And so if we could use sexual harassment as an example, you know, a lot of times people don't come forward with sexual harassment because, one, people don't believe you. We're seeing some shifts in that in pop culture and stuff, but people don't believe you, or you get swept up in this whole entire process that could be outside of you, that you can control, because it kind of becomes a legal thing, and then you have the whole weight of the organization coming down on you, and you can't necessarily drive the narrative, and then there are still repercussions that can happen against you for trying to speak up. And so now we take something like sexual harassment, which people can kind of grasp more so now than probably before, but then the problem of reporting is people believing you. So if I say that we're dealing with like racial microaggressions, like, am I going to come to my manager and say, hey, this person keeps asking me where I'm really from, and so now this person's going to get fired, or, you know, so the whole point of like microaggressions is someone's doing something like that, or not considering me, or rating me differently, of leaning in when they would rate a white woman leaning in very differently. What do you do within your companies to kind of drill down on this zero tolerance thing to really, one, support people and letting them know what is acceptable at all levels of behavior, from something like a microaggression to something that has more of a legal framework? And also, what are your processes for managing those types of interactions that maybe wouldn't rise to that high of a level, but are no doubt still impactful of how people show up and feel at work?
Well, I'll start by saying it's really important to create an environment within a company that people can have multiple different ways to report. Sometimes they're just not comfortable talking to their manager or to the HR person. You know, in our company, you can talk to an internal auditor, you can talk to the law department, you can talk to our compliance manager who runs our ethics and business conduct line. You can call that line anonymously. You can email that anonymously. So there's, depending on what the situation is, people have to have different avenues to be able to bring something up that might be really, really uncomfortable for them, because they might be worried about, is there going to be retaliation? If I bring it to my manager, what are they going to think differently of me? And so there has to be an environment where people feel safe and can bring those forward. The second piece of it is you really have to have an environment where there's an objective investigation that's done, and if it is substantiated, that actions are taken. And I will tell you, it may scare some of you, but about 4 months ago, someone brought up that someone else called them a name, and they felt very offended by it. You know, like, hey, you know, he may have been joking, but I just was not comfortable. And we did an investigation, and this person was a long-term employee, a professional employee. He was instant messaging at work with another professional employee, long-term employee, and we fired both of them that very next day. And so because of what you were talking about, it was a situation of zero tolerance. And what they were talking about in those instant messages is not something that was acceptable for our culture. Now, you know, we don't go look at people's instant messages, but if something's brought up, we're gonna do an investigation, and then if it is substantiated, we'll take action.
You know, I think you're talking about the really hard stuff, which is like the more nuanced stuff. Like it's clear if there are some lines which are clear, like I completely agree you have to have these way in. The competence that you're talking about is like, how do I develop competence in a manager that they actually understand why it's a problem if I keep asking you where you're from? And like, that's where I'm talking about this work being long, hard, and exhausting, because I think that takes time. I don't think we do it well, so I'm just gonna be transparent and say like, I think that's like probably an area where we suck. But I've been in other organizations where being part of a manager is actually, like, to be a manager, you have to start to understand, like we do unconscious bias training, which I think is the closest you get to it, which is at least to help people begin to understand that they might not know how they're perceiving or interpreting the world. But I don't know, I'm trying to think even in my other organizations, what you hope is that somebody had a place to go or a manager, and that someone had the sensibility enough to even understand why that would be a problem. In a way they could then communicate to somebody else the impression that they were leaving. And I think that that's probably where the hardest work is at the nuance. And I don't know if Amazon is a better.
I was just gonna add, don't forget about your voice. Your voice is probably the most powerful thing you have. And saying to someone, you know, I'm really not comfortable with you asking me that question. You know, that's an okay thing to do. And I think that, you know, it's kind of reverse education, right? Because it is hard work. And it's, you know, I had someone come to me once and say, well, just tell me everything I'm not supposed to say or do. And
I would do that. I would like to do that.
I actually said, you should be fired. I paid you to know what to say or do. You're a manager, my goodness. That I'm not gonna do that, right? So what, you're gonna pull out your guidebook and then if it's not in there, you're gonna do the wrong thing. So, you know, don't forget about your voice and letting people know if, hey, that just does not resonate with me or I feel really uncomfortable. That's very acceptable to do.
Yeah, I agree with these answers. I think, you know, having those proper avenues and channels and a variety of them is really important. And then also equipping managers and those who are having those conversations to be able to appropriately respond. And I think that it's really important that people who are also receiving that feedback receive it with humility and understand the amount of work that it requires for somebody to take that stance, you know, to stand up to them, especially as a manager. So yeah, I think it's hard work.
Can I just add something to that? Because I also think perhaps one of the things that people are thinking about in a moment like that is if they do tell it to someone, there are times I think when people, at the nuanced level, that people say, I don't think they meant it that way. So I do think there's something about the way that we are engaging people that says, when people come to you and tell you that that's a problem for them, it's a problem for them. And so I don't know, maybe the other part of that question is something about how you are also training and developing managers around these things. And I know training, you know, there's been a big, many studies about how training is not as effective as we would like for it to be in the diversity space.
But I think that's like good manager training. You know, like I do think there's a lot of evidence that diversity training doesn't work, but great management training. But this is where, like, it just seems to be a leader in an organization, you should have competence of understanding the world and where you live. Like, you just wonder how organizations can build that into just core manager competence. But the nuance thing, I will say, I think that what happens is over time, people are like, I'm not going to work here anymore. I mean, I think there's the like, it's a moment, and like you have a martini and you talk about it with somebody that like can help you process that. But if it's an environment where that stuff is normalized, people leave, you know? And if you're watching numbers, you start to see that. So I think I think this is the hard work of it. Like the nuance meets like, how do you have competent managers who know enough to know in the world why it would be ridiculous to repeatedly ask somebody where they're from?
Hi, I was just wondering, so in the workforce, I understand that bringing this back to not just internally, but also externally, while you're interviewing applicants and seeing who to hire and who to not hire. I understand all three companies are very different, and so I'm just wondering how, during the application process, you ensure diversity, but also being fair to applicants, because nowadays there's always problems about race, but also comparing qualifications. Not saying that there are any problems with it, but it's just that sometimes people will associate those two things as being mutually exclusive while it's not. So I'm just wondering how each of your companies deal with problems like those and the questions that arise from it.
Yeah, so we have, been exploring different avenues of kind of alternate avenues of hiring and looking for not only, definitely meeting the bar for Amazon hiring, which is a high bar, but also meeting a bar for distance traveled and, life experience and the kind of grit that a person might bring. And that's, it's definitely hard to measure, but we've partnered with groups like Ada Developers Academy here in Seattle and Apprenti. We've done a few different things internally to kind of look for new opportunities to hire people from maybe non-traditional sources. And we've had great success with that and bringing in really wonderful Amazonians. So I'm hoping to see more of that in the future too.
Yeah, we probably have more work to do in that area, but one of the things that we have been experimenting with, at least during the hiring process, is rewriting job descriptions. So that they aren't biased towards one gender or the other, and then taking names off applicant lists until we get to the final stages. And that's been really interesting and enlightening to do that work. We always want to hire the best person for the role. And so looking at it through a different lens has been really interesting, and we just started piloting that with some of our businesses this past year.
I don't have a lot to add. I mean, we track all the things. We haven't really had challenges along the diversity dimension to hiring. I will say, just as an adjacent point, that my husband leads a big talent organization for a tech company, and he always asks the question when he is hiring people, what's your point of view on diversity and inclusion in the workplace? And he said, if somebody is stumped and doesn't have an answer for me, it's a no-go. And he's trying to get just a question instituted as part of an interview protocol to say, and the thing is about any of these companies is that people know what you're asking. Like everyone knows how Amazon generally interviews. Like, why wouldn't we be asking people to bring a point of view? And so it's an interesting experiment on just introducing it as a requirement, which is different than, like maybe who is in your pipeline, where are they falling off, or how are competencies being assessed. But to the point of manager competency, I think will be an interesting trial and error. People are not excited about that question, by the way.
One last question.
So I just want to thank you guys for your perspective on the issues of like women in business, but also people of color in business and in corporate positions. And there are just like a few things that I've heard tonight that have just not rubbed me the right way, and I wanted to bring it up and see how y'all felt about it. So just recently, this woman over here brought up the point of saying sometimes it's hard
to confront the people that we're working with about the things that are offensive to us. Like every day, as a person of color, as a woman of color, I go through racial microaggressions and that kind of thing, and it builds up. And how am I supposed to communicate it in the way that it, you say that the world is an uncomfortable place. Like maybe comfort is overrated, but you don't necessarily have to say that to women of color, because women of color already know that it's an uncomfortable space to be living in, to be existing in. It's already tiring to just exist, and to put that in a corporate perspective just adds another level of not just being tired, but endangering our health. I think it's not just about comfort, it's about safety. It's about the fact that these words are not just uncomfortable, it's that they can be used as weapons to put us in danger to, like for me personally, I know that like being in some spaces at Seattle U and working to like even trying to like restructure curriculum to be less Eurocentric, I know that my voice matters, I know that it's important, but I don't know if other people know that, is I think what I'm trying to say, that it's not necessarily about me feeling comfortable in a space, it's about me feeling safe in a space, knowing that what I'm saying is actually being taken for what I mean. I know that in a lot of spaces, in a lot of classrooms, I have to water down what I'm trying to say, I have to simmer down my anger for the sake of making sure that other people are comfortable. So I would just hope that you understand that to me it's not just about creating a comfortable space, it's about creating a safe space in which we feel like we are free to express our opinions without fearing like retaliation or some kind of backlash. So my question is, how are you creating a safe space rather than just an inclusive and a comfortable space? Because there's a difference between comfort and support and safety.
I think thank you for your comments. I think it's a provocative, it's an interesting question. To me, it goes to what is the role of a company and what are your expectations of it? Like what will the role of an employer hold for you in terms of creating that? Because I think to create the space where thousands of people come to work, there are lots of people that hold back how they feel all the time. Because to put it into the room, whether that's as a woman of color, if it's a moment of feeling enraged, I think this last year there's like a collective trauma that people are feeling, and they carry that to work. And so I don't really have an answer except for to say work is a space that people come to do a job, and so we're trying to find a space where people have some ability to bring their whole selves with an understanding that it is limited because it's not our family, it's not even our community, it's not our circle of friends. And so I think it's like, what can we seek from that space? How can we hope to change it and influence those around us so that there's more and more space, knowing that it's imperfect because it's an organization which exists to produce work. And so for me, like that's how I think about it without having, I think, a perfect answer.
I would just say thank you for saying that. I think it took a lot of courage for you to share your personal experiences in front of a large group. So thank you for being open. I think it's really important that you find allies, that a mentor, someone that you can talk to, someone that you have a trusting relationship with, who can, help in different situations with regard to, hear me out on how I feel about this and what's your advice on how should I approach it? And depending on, is it a work environment, is it an educational environment, what are the social norms? If I go in yelling and screaming or crying or, am I going to be effective in really making the change that I want to see? How can I really be successful? And so finding those people, and there's lots of people out there, whether it's here at Seattle U or in the workforce, who are willing to do that for people. I think I would really encourage people when you're going through situations to do that. And then lastly, if it's a work environment, one of the things that I always say to people, I didn't think about this when I was 20, but I sure thought about it a lot during the course of my 35 plus career I started when I was 4, was, go to work for a company that you align with their vision and values and their core ethics. Don't work for a company that doesn't align with that, because that's going to go through everything in that company, whether it's, financial results, marketing, employees, whatever it might be. It's really important. And so if you're in a situation and you feel angst and it's just not the right fit, you'll know it in your gut, and go to work for a company where you're going to be aligned and your voice will be heard.
I'd love to hear Dr. Ferrara's perspective too on this. I think, what's been said is really poignant, and I don't know that I have much to add, but I'd love to hear your thoughts here.
Well, so, I think I agree that, I think partly what the question that I heard was, or the question that I heard, and also the comments that you made, were if the space is unsafe, if it's been made unsafe by someone, what do companies do to enable people to be able to actually come to work? When I teach my diversity class, I always say this, it's not just, sometimes you can't find a place that aligns with your values, it's hiring, right? So you have to work because you have to eat. And so being able to go into many companies and find a space where I'm able to be there and be in the space and get my work done is important. Even if there are things about the company that maybe I wouldn't want to be there, but I have to have a job. So I think partly there's some really great research that has come up recently because of our much of diversity training not being as successful as we would like, right? So to the extent that we would be able to train people to create the safer space, but companies can do things, what are being called bias interrupters. There are things that we could build into our systems. Sort of what you were talking about with, let's take the names off. Are there good ways for people to be able to come and share? This is why I believe in affinity groups. I'm always concerned when people say they break it down because there's power in numbers. So having places where people can come and say, look, I'm having this problem, you're having this problem. It's time probably for us to go and take this to someone because this is our safe space where we're able to share that. And companies can create that. So I do think that there are things that companies can do, and there's some really good research and some good examples of what companies are doing. If any of you are interested too, you could look at UC Hastings has this whole area around bias interrupters and things that companies can do when people don't want to do the right thing. And it's 6:45. I think it's actually a little bit past 6:45. So thank you very much for your attendance and for your questions.